Fowler of International Intrigue. John, welcome.
Thank you, Dmitry. I am nervous-ish to see how this will go, but excited.
I mean, it's going to go badly, is how it's going to go. I don't know. Nervous implies there's a chance things won't go well, whereas it's a near goddamn certainty. We're probably
Yeah,
muted. Based on my track record, we're probably muted right now.
which generally the reviews when we're muted are good.
Yeah, we have very animated faces, but nothing of value to say. Do you want to before we get into what this show is going to be? Do you want to tell the good people what International Intrigue is?
Yeah, sure. So it's a daily newsletter which focuses on global affairs and geopolitics, mostly short, pithy explainers of news going on around the world, with a little bit of analysis thrown in. My co-founder is also a former gruntled diplomat, so we just thought there was a bit of a gap in the market for kind of explaining the stuff that we're going to try and do today, but in a short form newsletter every day.
So, International Intrigue hits your newsletter. It's a free newsletter. You should all sign up to. We'll be posting links in all of the appropriate places. But
Yeah,
but it's kind of about, you guys normally do about 4 or 5 stories a day.
right. So we try to cover one issue in a bit more depth, and we spin around a region each day of the week, so Latin America or Africa or whatever, and then a couple of other tidbits in there. I think the way that we've best described it is kind of like the Economist content
Hmm.
in a morning brew style.
Okay, two incredibly niche references. No one outside the IR community can follow,
People
but
can just Google it, figure it out.
look, it's short words done good. I don't know.
Exactly, that's it.
So for this show, what we want to do is want to kind of take that digest and, in a way, digest it even further, like double digesting, like we're regurgitating birds. But take a couple of those stories that really struck out to you and the International Intrigue team, and kind of cover them in a bit more of a dynamic format, which we'll then sort of cut up for clips, podcast, do all of that good stuff with, as well as
Hmm.
also diving into a bit more detail on like one story each week that we find particularly interesting, to try to offer perspectives from people who have been in the trenches of diplomacy as we sort of have.
Right. And I think one of the things that's important here is that you know a lot of stuff that I have no idea about. So I might be the kind of normie here where you say stuff and I go, oh, tell me more, because I have no idea about half the things you know.
I think you're reading
No
from
pressure.
my half of the script, dude. Um, my golden philosophy of not reading anything I didn't write, has limited my knowledge. So what are we going to do today in this first kind of pilot episode? We're going to start by going through they're not the top 5 stories from this week's Intrigue. A lot of the stories in Intrigue are hugely important, but they're 5 that we wanted to unpack a tiny bit. And for each one of those, John's going to set us up by explaining what they are. And then we're each going to take 60 seconds with a goofy timer to basically provide one kind of instant reaction or hot take, and then kind of move on. This is a policy we instituted after we did a trial run of this show, and it ran for, I think, 27 hours. So we are trying to exercise some discipline so that we do not simply rant forever. So we'll be covering 5 stories, and we'll go through each of them in that format. And then after we've gone through those 5 format and offered our hot takes for whatever they're worth, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into some of the recent stories coming out of the invasion of Ukraine. We're going to look at the retaking of Kherson. We're going to look at the missile that killed 2 Polish farmers and sort of the fallout from that. And we're going to look a little bit at today's news of the MH17 tribunal handing down its ruling, as well as John's going to walk us through some of the diplomatic developments in Ankara as sort of high-level officials meet. And then finally, assuming I haven't completely failed at moderation and we're not at like hour 7 by that point, we shamelessly solicited some questions from you on Twitter and Mastodon. We've picked a couple of those questions, and we're going to do our best to answer them. We'll be trying to do that every week to make sure that in addition to the things that we find interesting, we're also addressing the things that you hopefully find a little bit interesting. And that's going to be our show. Once again, it's entirely possible we are incredibly muted right now. But based on the comments, we are audible, but John is very quiet, so I'm going to boost his level a bit.
Oh, okay.
No one's
I can
ever
just start screaming.
Yeah, I don't think anybody's ever accused you of being quiet in
No,
years at DFAT.
I'm shocked.
Yeah, would have been a very different career. Okay, so if you are ready, John, do you want to tee us off with our first story, Ethiopia-Tigray?
Yeah, so this is the news a couple of weeks ago. I think it was early November that the Ethiopian government and the Tigrayan armed forces, the rebel forces in the north of Ethiopia, agreed to a peace treaty or at least a peace deal. They've been fighting for about 2 years in a civil war in Ethiopia, which has been incredibly deadly. So it's good news. And it was signed after about a week of African Union-led negotiations. So what are your thoughts on that, Dmitry?
So if I'm going to give myself 60 seconds as promised. Go timer. The one thing that really jumped out at me about this story, apart from I can't believe we have good news to report. I don't know how to process that. But it's the role of the African Union here as sort of offering both good officers, which is a diplomatic term for where you provide a space where the two sides can meet and be supported in reaching a diplomatic conclusion, but also in kind of stepping up to leadership on the continent. It's been something the AU has been doing more and more and more. And I think having those solutions come from the African Union, assuming they hold, but even sort of temporary wins are good wins, is a fantastically positive step for the region. It puts leadership where it belongs, which is in neighboring countries, and it decreases the pressure on the UN.
You nailed it.
Nailed it. 60 seconds.
I just lost a lot of money on some bets.
All right. You think you're so good? Do you want to have a go? 60 seconds?
Sure. I mean, all of what you just said is bang on, but I think whenever I see, particularly with a 2-year civil war ending quite abruptly, and it was quite a surprise. I think most people who were watching this didn't expect something to come through so quickly. So that always makes me go, why? What happened? And I think if you dig into the deal and you sort of read around it, it's pretty clear that the Tigrayan forces were at the end of their leash, as it were. They've run out of supplies. The humanitarian situation in the north of the country is a disaster. So while I think this is being pitched as a meeting of kind of equals coming to a peace agreement, it was much more of the Ethiopian government kind of winning, unfortunately, through sort of attrition, stalemate, and the kind of understanding that the humanitarian situation was out of control. Going forward, I think Ethiopia is going to absorb Tigray back into the country, but give it some concessions politically.
Also 60 seconds, and that zero flashing is quite ominous.
Yeah, it is a bit.
Okay, so that was Ethiopia-Tigray. If you want, do you want to set us up for the next one? TikTok and European user data.
One of the things we're doing is trying to have a variety of stories in this little bit, and this one is about TikTok in Europe. So I think there was a news report, might have been in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago, again showing that TikTok can access European users' private data beginning in December, and it's quality, like to manage TikTok's quality performance. But obviously that has set a lot of governments running to the megaphones to denounce it. So yeah. And we can put links to these stories in the YouTube afterwards, just so you can kind of get some more context on the background if you're not aware of them.
Absolutely, that's a good reminder. Before we do, so Intrigue collects sort of sources from almost everywhere, and we'll be sure to put them all up so that you can kind of dig deeper on your own. Okay, I can have a go at 60 seconds of reaction to that if I can get my
Mm.
timer going. Um, and I know this is kind of a lot of the focus has been on TikTok because of the link to Tencent and to link to China and people's security concerns. But I think there's a broader thing going on here, which is that a hugely booming area of trade is in trade in services and specifically trade in intermediate services. So having your medical notes, which are illegibly scribbled by a doctor, sent to a country where labor is cheap, but they speak the language of your hospital, having them transposed overnight and sent back in a digital format. That kind of stuff is incredibly lucrative, and it's a huge growth opportunity, and it's a huge saving opportunity for companies in more expensive markets. And that's without even getting into kind of algorithmic analytics and this other kind of stuff. And so there's going to be this constant tension of where does this happen and how do you balance privacy with the savings that come from that?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what all these governments are so scared about with TikTok, isn't it? It's, I mean, it's also the government behind TikTok is obviously China, and I've spent some time in China, and anybody who spent time there knows that there is no such thing as kind of the hiving off of information from the Communist Party. So I think that's what people are scared of. Do you want to start my timer, or I'll just ramble?
Mm, Timer started, go.
There we go. Yeah, so I mean, I think the concern is everything you've just said there, but the people behind TikTok are a government that, you know, a lot of Western governments don't necessarily feel comfortable with. Um, I think the big question is, you know, we had that thing with Donald Trump in his last couple of years where he was looking to ban TikTok or at least force a sale to a US company. Big question is, as these kinds of revelations come out, you know, TikTok is abusing data, TikTok, you know, all those kinds of things that will inevitably come out. Let's be perfectly honest about that. Does TikTok get banned in any jurisdictions? I know that the US commentators on the US situation are kind of saying, well, I think the US government is just looking for an excuse to ban TikTok. This kind of maybe might be half of an excuse, kind of gets them closer to that. European governments are, you know, pretty keen to crack down on big tech. So I think it's a really open question about whether TikTok is forced to be sold or even gets outright banned in Western jurisdictions in the near future. It's one to watch.
Yeah. If you want to see the youth mobilized politically, just wait to see what happens if you ban TikTok. Um, uh,
That's right.
First, I'll have
I
to
don't even
remember.
know how they do it, to be honest.
Yeah. Um, I just need to know I can still. I mean, India's done it. TikTok is unavailable in India. So it is technically possible.
Technically possible, but politically, I just yeah, it seems the US banning TikTok seems difficult from a messaging perspective about free enterprise and all that. But anyway,
Yeah. Okay. Do you want to set us
next
up
one.
our next story? Qatar World
Yeah,
Cup.
so this one's close to my heart. World Cup kicking off on Sunday. It's a little bit. I admit to sort of feeling a bit conflicted about this one because it's held in Qatar, which obviously had a lot of problems. So we wrote in International Intrigue. We did a bit of a deep dive on the upcoming World Cup and the sort of expanding prevalence, particularly amongst Middle Eastern countries, for sports washing. The idea that you can launder your country's reputation through these big, glitzy, glamorous, generally apolitical events. I know you love sport. What's your take on this, Dmitry?
Yeah, I just had to Google what sport the World Cup is. All these notes I have on horse racing are worthless now. But okay, this is gonna be a blisteringly hot take based on very little sports knowledge, but maybe it'll be relevant to somebody. So the one thing that I keep coming back to is that we are going to be in this situation over and over again with big events, whether it's the World Cup, whether it's the Olympics, because firstly, we have very ill defined what we want out of a host. And the current metrics that we use for a host are basically like, what can you offer the Olympic Committee or what can you offer FIFA? How many stadiums are you willing to put up? How many kind of brand deals are you willing to do? And frankly, historically, it feels like, are you willing to be less than scrupulous in how you engage with the selecting committee. Famously, you know, there were accusations that those who picked the Sochi for the Winter Olympics received like houses by way of gifts from Vladimir Putin. So my one sense is like, we're all outraged about Qatar now, but this is just going to keep happening until we fundamentally change what we want out of a host.
Yeah, I think that's bang on. Kind of twas ever thus, though. I mean, the Olympics, in a way, is the original kind of idea of, you know, getting over political differences and coming together under a banner. I mean, and in one sense, you know, one person's sports washing is another person's kind of putting aside our differences and coming together over shared humanity, if you want to be kind of
Oh,
very
I mean,
generous with your interpretation.
the Pope suggested that everybody in Ukraine stop shooting at each other for a month to watch the
Right,
football,
right.
which
Yeah.
did not necessarily win His Holiness a huge amount of fans in Ukraine. But you know, that was the approach of like, can this be a peace building thing?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so I think that I mean, I have 1,000 thoughts on this kind of stuff.
All right, so I'm
But
definitely starting the timer then. If you've got
yeah,
a thousand
start it
thoughts.
and yeah, exactly, please. Otherwise, I'll ramble. But I think there's a couple of things. One, it's very interesting to see the collapse of FTX in the last couple of weeks and noticing that crypto, as a general principle, has sponsored giant sporting arenas all over the US in the very same kind of principle of washing their reputation, or at least trying to gain legitimacy in the eyes of sports fans, who are, you know, a lot of the sort of population. This is no different. Qatar has an appalling record on human rights, particularly when it was building the stadiums for the World Cup. I think 6,500. I think that's right. Migrant workers died constructing them, which is just an unfathomable amount of people to people in Western countries to die building buildings.
Yeah.
But you know, it's a big problem. I know the English Premier League has, you know, Newcastle United was bought by the Saudis. You know, Chelsea was owned recently by a Russian oligarch. So I think countries are going to have to start thinking about how they put in regulatory regimes to sort of at least audit this when people are trying to sports wash.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard to get away from the sense that these kind of purchases are large, really prestige investments that people with a lot of money make.
Yeah,
And you know, whether it's FTX or whether it is, you know, the
Qatar,
how yeah,
Saudis.
Qatar, the Saudis, you're not always going to be completely comfortable with sort of how the money that makes that purchase happen was made.
Yeah.
I think it's just sort of something we have to, as you say, perhaps something for regulators to look at. But anytime you get regulators into the business of deciding who's moral enough to buy something, people get nervous too. So
Well, that's true. I mean, they already do that in a lot of sports. You have fit and proper ownership tests. But yeah, I agree. It's a difficult question.
I just need Elon Musk to buy all sports and kill them off so that I understand conversations again. I grew up in Australia, guys. You have no idea
Yeah,
what it
right.
was like. I didn't know anything that was happening for like 23 years. I'm the real victim here, is I guess what I'm saying. All right. Speaking of real victims, our next story.
Oh boy.
Um,
That's a spicy take. The next story we're just we covered this well 2 weeks ago, but I think it's really consequential for the Middle East is Bibi Netanyahu's return to power in Israel. He was out of power for 17 months, and he has basically been the prime minister. I don't know, like I think this is his fifth time or fourth time in power. Um, so yeah, he has won with a very, very hard right coalition that will come and form government, and it is a huge development, I think, for the region.
okay. What 1 minute takes on the Levant? This always ends well for everybody's long-term
Yeah,
political.
I think no one will
Uh,
misinterpret what we say.
yep. Oh God. Okay, so just in 1 minute, I guess what I wanted to focus on is that the Israeli political system is effectively designed in such a way that it has, I don't know if tempted is the right word, but it has effectively drifted Bibi Netanyahu, who, okay, was never a dove, Sort of no one's going to confuse him with a woke progressive, especially on security issues. But effectively, every time he has come to power and had to build a coalition, he has effectively had to find coalition partners further on the right. And every time he does that,
Yeah.
he effectively has to buy them off by aligning at least part of his approach and rhetoric with them. And while he's always had this kind of wink wink, like, okay, I'm not maybe exactly where my hardest right coalition members are, just by weight of numbers, they're pulling him to the further to the right. And that has big implications for Middle East peace, for the region, for the occupied territories, for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, spot on. That's what stands out for me is like this is probably not great news for, the peace process. Two-state solution stuff, I think, is definitely set back by his return. Or yeah, you're right. What it's probably more accurate to say by the return of the coalition that he needed to win power, rather than him himself. Although, as you say, he's never been a dove. I think one interesting angle for this is the US have been quite strident in their language towards the Israelis about who takes up pretty key positions in the Israeli government when it gets formed. I think I don't know who it was. It might have been Blinken, but it probably wasn't Blinken. It was probably someone further down the food chain a little bit. But they were pretty firm that I think his name is Itamar. I'm reading it. Itamar Ben Gavir. Excuse my pronunciation there. Who is a super hardline right winger in his coalition. I think there was some talk about making him defense minister. And the US responded by saying, we would find it very difficult to engage with someone like him in such a key role. But that's a pretty big statement. Obviously, Israel's defense is one of their key portfolios. The US is key to Israel's defense. So it'll be interesting to see what role the most hardline kind of people in the coalition take up. And I think that will be a signal to how the next couple of years of the Israeli government will go. Do they get the biggest positions, or does Bibi manage to kind of put them in places where they can't cause too much trouble?
We don't really have time to get into it now, but I think if you're going to follow along with some of these stories, it's worth reading just what the positions of these folks are, because they are sort of, it's hard to oversell how right wing these folks are, to the point of sort of flirting with sort of supporting settler sort of violence in order to sort of establish greater lands for Israeli settlers. Sort of quite extreme positions. This isn't just somebody who opposes the two-state solution. These folks are quite on the fringes, even in a right-wing government. So it's worth sort of reading the links, because it's troubling if he goes in that direction, and frankly, just their presence in the coalition is also probably room for concern.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, the last of our 5 quick hits, which I noticed are probably running a little bit over as we predicted, is we covered the Iranian protests that have been going since, don't quote me on this, but I think around the 15th or 16th of September. So that we're getting into kind of 2 full months of protests in Iran, which is quite remarkable when you think about it. But also the reports that the government has issued the first death sentence to a protester who was sentenced, I think, earlier this week, a 22-year-old named Masa Amini. So, yeah, what are your takes on the Iranian protest, the continuing Iranian protest?
I mean, first of all, there's no way to kind of get to the end of any sentence about this without just being blown away by the courage of the people taking to the streets. I'm Ukrainian, so sort of I'm heavily invested in Euromaidan, and this is sort of that same sense of we can no longer live like this, even in the face of brutality. That's incredibly moving. But I guess one specific thing I can think about is that how few options the international community really has here. um, overt support, which many people have called for, there is a strong sense that that would give the regime license to declare the entire uprising a foreign construct and to crack down in ways even beyond what it's doing now. Sanctions, Iran is sanctioned in just about every way imaginable already. So there's just simply not too far more you can go there. And clandestine support seems like a dangerous road and it's difficult to do. So one of the things that's really struck me about this is how everybody watching it from the outside, no matter their investment, the policy options are so incredibly limited.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to touch on. I don't have much more to add to it other than just sort of every time these protests, things like this in countries that we as Westerners sort of feel require or need liberalization, particularly around human rights. Every time these things kick off, whether it's in the Arab Spring, a decade ago, Russia when the war broke out in February, or China when anything happens, there is this really wishful thinking from a group of people about like, oh, this is it, like they're going to overthrow the government and blah blah blah. And when it sort of inevitably doesn't happen, or at least not inevitably, but when it most likely doesn't happen, there is this pushback about how we're not doing enough to help, or we're not, what can we do to help? And you laid it out perfectly there. There isn't a lot that you can do short of military action, which I don't think anybody thinks is a good idea. So I think there's two more things that sort of jump out to me, is just that they're still going on, which tells me that the Iranian government doesn't have a great handle on its domestic security position. So perhaps in as they sort of look to get a handle on the protests, they'll be pulling back their foreign adventurism a little bit, just because they can't do all the things at once. And clearly the Iranian government isn't as good, or is struggling more than it has in the past to get a handle on this stuff.
Indeed, and the fact that it's happening in places where it has traditionally felt much more secure,
Right.
sort of,
yeah.
outside the capital, in some of these cities, in incredibly religious sort of part of the country, where traditionally they wouldn't have expected to see people on the streets. As you say, every time this kicks off, we think, aha, now peace and justice will reign. And I think it was on Jon Stewart's podcast that somebody said it's just incredibly hard to unseat the people with the guns. And at least for the moment, it feels like the Iranian government still has the guns, and still has
40 years of 40 years of practicing how to use them and to put people in jail. I mean, I think they've arrested 15,000 people over the last 2 months, which that takes some infrastructure to be able to pull off.
And they've handed down their first death sentence to a protester, which is sort of a turning point. I will say that a turning point in the Revolution of Dignity, Euromaidan, was when there was a sense among older people that the regime was killing their children, because the riot police were literally beating them to death on the streets. So I think the Iranian regime also has to tread carefully, and that overusing force can be just as sort of deadly to a regime as allowing these things to go on. But that's neither here nor there. And that's our 5 stories.
Cheery note to end on, huh?
Yeah. Really should have put that
learning.
Or just done a TikTok dance as part of, instead of doing a TikTok story. I don't know. Okay.
One of the things we talked about before this was like, we want to try and make it a little like, energizing and lighthearted. And then you sit there and you look at the list of stories you have to go through and you're like, well, I don't know how I'm going to do that.
If International Intrigue just covered more like amusing pets, that would be, it could be an interesting new pivot for you folks. Okay, right, so did you want to take us to our main story?
Yes.
Ukraine.
So we thought that would be, obviously the Ukraine war has been going since the late February. So in one sense, there's always news, and in another sense, there's not always a lot of new stuff. But I think the last week, 10 days, there has been some real updates in the news. And as you're going to be in charge of pronunciation of all the cities and whatnot, but they retook, how did you say it?
Kherson.
Okay.
You just kind of have to phlegm it.
Yeah, I'm not even going to try to do that. Ukraine obviously was remarkably triumphant coming back into that with relatively little resistance. I mean, the Russians kind of got pinned against the river there, and a bit of a chaotic extraction. We had the missile hitting Poland, as you said, on when was that, Tuesday? And then the news today about the MH17 tribunal in the Netherlands. So there is quite a lot of actual new news. So why don't we start with I give a quick update on where the front lines are these days? Because I mean, again, that's been a moving, well, quite literally a moving line. We've got the map up there, which shows the current situation, which is Crimea in the bottom in the black shaded portion. Kherson is, sorry, I'm just not going to try and say it because I'll get myself in trouble. Is in the south there. So you see, Russia's still got huge swathes of the south under its control, all east of the, how do you say that one? Dnipro?
Dnieper.
Okay, again, the river, east of the river, and up into the Donetsk and Luhansk, not oblast, I guess they're provinces. Are they oblasts in Ukraine?
They're both oblasts, yeah. Luhansk and Donetsk are oblasts.
Yeah, okay. So, Russia still has a huge swathe of what is Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, obviously, from 2014. But if you compare that, and I don't know if we've got the map, we probably don't, but if you compare that to sort of, March, April, and May, where, they were all around Kharkiv and then coming down into Kiev, it's pretty remarkable to see how little Russia has actually taken as we sit here in November, versus the losses that they've incurred, the political isolation, the cost of their economy, the cost that Russia has generally paid when you sum it all up for what we're seeing in that map. In a very, and I know that sounds like quite insensitive to sort of, do those calculations, but, that's how these people do the calculations. That's how military commanders and political commanders do make those kind of calculations. The cost there for the benefit is pretty remarkably low, it strikes me, Dmitry.
And that's even without getting into the fact that simply occupying that territory isn't the same as holding it or integrating it. There are efforts to kind of instill a love of Russia in people whose houses they've recently driven tanks through has not necessarily yielded dividends. There's a good New York Times story that was an intrigue, sort of talking about their complete failure to do this in Kherson. But I guess on the territory point, one thing I wanted to point out, just as an interesting thing, is that the way Ukraine has gone about taking these large population centers, when you contrast it to the Russian approach, the Ukrainian approach has been effectively attempts to encircle and use long-range HIMARS and Crabs and Caesars to knock out the supply lines and effectively force Russian troops to pull out of that territory by threatening them with a lack of supply and encirclement. And so by doing that, they've managed to avoid getting enmeshed in sort of battles
Urban
in
warfare,
exactly, battles in the suburbs of major cities. Kherson has had a population close to 300,000 people. That's a big population center. You do not want to be going house to house fighting through that, and you certainly don't want to be doing it when the people whose houses you're shooting through are your citizens.
Don't want you there. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
So it's been a really telling kind of a much more modern approach to urban warfare, a lot more special forces on the front lines, which minimizes casualties, versus, for example, the direct contrast is with how Russia and specifically the Wagner mercenaries are trying to take Bakhmut by effectively just throwing soldiers at the Ukrainian defenders over and over again in the hopes of wearing them down. And I think it's a really telling contrast, both kind of militarily and, I guess, ethically. So it's just something that struck out to me about the way Ukraine has consistently gone about retaking its territory.
Yeah, which I think it's a great point, but you touched on something about why, that New York Times article, which I really recommend everyone reading, about, how the Russians tried to indoctrinate Ukrainian kids with, the anthem and language and all that kind of stuff. But you are Ukrainian and you have deep insights into these kinds of things. Like, why do you think that didn't work? Putin was saying at the start we're all one people. And, I guess 2014 showed that, particularly in the East, a lot of folks in Ukraine do consider themselves, at least partly Russian, or at least attached to the Russian identity. Yet, is it just the media showing us one side of this story, or are Ukrainians really anti-Russian now because of what's happened?
So first of all, obviously, sentiment towards Russia is pretty dire at the moment. I would say that a lot of the reporting misconstrued sentiments in the East, which, like, I am positively disposed towards Russia, or I would
Versus
support
I
a
am
part
Russian.
exactly, or I would support a party that wants closer relations with Russia, over
Right.
versus like I want to be ruled by the Russian Federation, or I am a Russian citizen abroad.
Yeah.
And so I
Yeah.
think that part of that, also the Russians just aren't very good at this in a short term. We've got leaks from Ukrainian intelligence and others of the way they were trying to do this indoctrination. And like, this is not sophisticated psyops, guys. Like, making kids sing the anthem when like their schools are ruined because you shelled it probably isn't going to do it. And it's certainly not going to do it in 4 months. So, I mean, it's
It's a very colonialist attitude, isn't it? It's sort of
oh,
very like, walk in there and they will love us, and we will
yeah.
we will simply, give them cricket, or whatever the Russian version of that is.
And the track record of colonialist regimes making anyone but their sort of chosen sort of local rajas like them is pretty bad. Most colonial regimes were detested by the people that
Mm.
they kind of ruled over, apart from a very small ruling elite that kind of directly benefited from, and that seems to be what's happened here as well. They were very popular with the people they made governor of the region, having
Right.
sometimes like pulled them out of a prison. Um,
Right.
so that's kind of
So
mhm,
yeah, so if you take, well, I mean, for example, you mentioned the media kind of not getting the nuances of that story right. If we pivot then and kind of look at that Polish missile situation in earlier this week, which I think initially hit the media, perhaps not mainstream media, but at least the sort of Twitter sphere and other
mhm.
outlets, as, oh my God, Russia has attacked Poland slash what, NATO Article 5 nuclear war is imminent. What's your take on all of that situation?
So at the moment, what we have is that a missile hit Poland and unfortunately killed two farmers. It hit near a farm. The Ukrainian president is saying that his people are telling him it was a Russian missile. The NATO appears to be saying that they believe it was a Ukrainian sort of anti missile that hit this farm. And at the moment, both are sticking to their guns until somebody investigates. Now, my sense is this was never going to trigger World War III. There are kind of three options here for what could have happened. Either Russia deliberately launched a missile into Poland in order to see what NATO would do, which doesn't seem very likely to me, because it'd be a strange, like, why a
And why
farm?
now?
Why now? Why a farm? Like, and what were they hoping to achieve?
So I guess it's like not impossible, but you have to ask when you sit there and you go, okay, in the scheme of like probabilities,
Yeah,
there's too many questions that don't make sense. So you have to assign a very low probability to that outcome.
exactly. The second option is Russian missile aiming at Ukraine misses and hits Poland. I think you've got to apply a fair amount of just on the basis that could happen.
Hugely probable given their targeting and the state of their
Exactly.
military and what we've seen. Yeah.
And then thirdly, a Ukrainian missile sent up to knock out a Russian missile either goes haywire or hits the missile, and then sort of both of them hit the Polish farm. I don't know.
Something happens. Yeah.
Again, which is also kind of possible. In none of those
Yes.
situations, in all of those situations, the policy outcome is almost certainly Russia's neighbors that are in NATO receive more anti-aircraft sort of cover than they had last month. That is the policy outcome in almost all of those cases. NATO Article 4, Article 5, whatever you want to call it, nobody was, in none of those three scenarios, do the F-35s cross the border to raid, to start knocking out missile sites in Russia, which is how we get to World War III. So that was kind of my take. And I think a lot of the media reporting kind of, which treats NATO Article 5 like the second it's triggered, the nuclear missiles are already in the air, like it's war games or something, I thought was problematic.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think one thing that stuck out to me was how quickly Biden from Bali at the G20, they all got together and had a sort of that they showed how collaborative the G20, or I think was it the G20, it might have been the G7 nations who actually met the leaders of the G7 nations. Photo op to show collaborative, kind of almost like a war council. But then Biden's I thought, very clear messaging was it's unlikely. Basically saying this wasn't a Russian missile fired from within Russia intentionally. Chill the F out, everybody.
Yeah.
Which I thought was, I mean, both very, very good messaging, but also I think kind of shows an I don't know how to quite to phrase this, but like a disregard of the media at the moment, where sort of the media is going to sort of be very, very, oh my God, what did it happen? He doesn't come out and go like, listen, we're going to, we don't know what, it's too early to say. They've kind of made clearly their initial intelligence estimates pretty public straight away. So, you might expect them to say, we don't know, we're not sure, we're not going to say anything until we are sure, until we've investigated. But he, within a couple of hours, was able to say, listen, it's basically not what you say it is. And I think that's very interesting to kind of compare with, I guess how previous presidents or previous administrations, particularly intelligence parts of administrations, have dealt with the media and saying it's all cloak and daggers, it's all shadows, we don't know, strategic ambiguity, all that kind of stuff. Anyway, I thought that was an interesting
There's a great clip of Biden from I think it was from Bali, where a journalist goes, "Can you tell us what you know about the missile in Poland?" And he just goes, "No," and it just kind of. But yeah, I mean, it reminds me of Biden's presidential campaign, the motto of which was "Don't read Twitter." Like it wasn't a reactive kind of approach, and I think it probably served world peace well this week.
And makes the US really credible, I think, too, because a lot of people who are cynical, there are elements within Western countries who are looking for an excuse to dial back their support for Ukraine, and perhaps use the Russian war as, a little bit of like a way to make their own domestic political points. And, there must have been a tempting element within the US and Western countries to say, hey, even though Russia didn't do this, we can make them look really bad and even more monstrous. And then I think it gives the US a lot of credibility that straight away they came out and said, no, it wasn't Russia. It was probably, well, they didn't say it was a Ukrainian mistake, but like that's what it looks like it was. And I think now it makes them, the next thing they say, just add the believability to their statements, which I think, I mean, they have a lot of work to do in the trust deficit as a country in general. But I think it's an interesting outcome, and I think that is a good segue into the idea that if nuclear war is the kind of big flashing light on all of this, it's a good thing that it seems like there are adults in the room, and it's a good thing that it seems like Russian and US officials are talking relatively frequently. Like the CIA director was in Ankara in Turkey earlier this week to meet Narishkin. How do I say that?
Narishkin.
Perfect. His counterpart in Russia to kind of, I'm sure to have conversations about, vaguely coded messages where they sit there and say, my president just told me to tell you this. But the idea that they're having conversations, you can get a feel for people in the room. You can get a sense for if they're, if they're kind of paranoid and you can correct misgivings.
Yeah.
It's so important to keep talking. I think that's kind of a pretty positive thing. I don't like to use that word around this whole situation, but
I mean, just the fact that there is someone that you can call in Russia to go, did you guys just launch a missile attack on Poland? What are you doing? And they go, no, we didn't. And you have somebody to start that dialogue with, rather than sitting on opposite ends of a wall, I think is helpful.
Yeah, I completely agree.
In the interest of time, we might move to our questions from Twitter, and we're going to do sort of quick hits on these, because I think all of them open up really big cans of worms. Might start with you, John. We had a question from was it Moonwalker. So what's what does Taiwan do, and does the West's response to Ukraine affect China's next steps in Taiwan?
Yeah, I mean, this is the question that's basically been asked about China from the moment that Russia attacked Ukraine back in February. Um, it's a huge question. I think so. The context here is that Xi Jinping has just re-established himself for another term minimum. Massively consolidated his power within Chinese Communist Party structure. He is essentially untouchable now, or at least very close to that. And what he says will go. So that's the first bit of context. The second bit of context is that Taiwan, the reunification of Taiwan, which the Chinese Communist Party considers a runaway province, that is a non-negotiable for the Communist Party. It always has been, but under Xi Jinping, it's like the thing. He wants to bring it back to China as like the completion of his legacy. He's very into sort of these destiny. I think he sees himself as a man of destiny, and Taiwan would complete it. So that's the state of play. Is that Taiwan is super important. Xi Jinping wants it, and Xi Jinping can do whatever he wants within China. Obviously, the US is involved insofar as they don't want that to happen. I think there was some interesting kind of rumors / reports floating around, which I think the genesis of was actually US naval intelligence, like officially, but just saying that there's this window that the Chinese have decided on between now and 2027 to retake Taiwan, because they estimate that that's when they'll be able to take Taiwan. I think there was a good point made by someone where it's like, it's not about China defeating America at war, it's about relative strength in that region. And I think this report from the US thinks that China thinks that they will be ahead of the US in Taiwan until 2027. So you have this window of opportunity for China to retake Taiwan. You have China wanting to retake Taiwan. The question then becomes when, or largely when, and what does the US do? I personally don't think Ukraine makes the situation worse. I think the Ukraine, if anything, tells China that they can't make a mistake. Military options are literally the absolute last thing they want to do. So I think in a way it makes Taiwan, the chances of a Taiwan war a little less likely. I have a lot of friends who think the opposite. I think I have a lot of friends who say that the US and the West is so focused on Europe still. It's like a mentality thing, that they will just not be able to effectively prepare for the Chinese and the Taiwan situation. But I think largely the short answer is that the Ukraine doesn't change much about China's approach to Taiwan, other than maybe make it more conservative. The issue is still huge. It's the biggest unknown in world geopolitics right now.
Yeah, I think that's probably immensely fair. I think it's also fair to say that you can't guess what the lessons China itself has learnt from Ukrainian resistance, the performance of the Russian army, and Western sanctions is. There's one way you could look at it where you go, oh no, it's a really bad idea to try your largely untested armed forces against determined resistance. It ends really badly, and maybe our army's not as good as our generals are telling us it is. Oh, and look, the West rallied on sanctions. But then there's another way where you look at it and you go, well, Europe didn't cut gas, so on things that are critically important to the European economy, even with a crisis in their own backyard, they didn't immediately pull the cord. B, the Chinese army is not the Russian army, and we won't make the same mistakes. And, maybe they think Taiwan is not Ukraine. So like all of these kind of, you just don't know what the lessons even they're learning, let alone the rest of us are.
Yeah,
that's one
I
to watch.
completely agree.
Might do one more question. I might take my hand at this one. We got a question from Rahul on Twitter asking, will the UN and WTO exist in 20 years, and what will inform their future shape, status, and influence? And Rahul particularly was interested in views from outside the US, EU, and China. I very, very briefly, yes, I do think they will exist, not just because it is virtually impossible to kill an IGO. These things sort of, the last after World War III, there will still somehow be committee meetings in New York, Geneva, and Nairobi, because these things never die. But more seriously, it is precisely the states outside those three kind of global emerging superpowers where organizations like the UN and WTO offer a lot in terms of ability to influence the global agenda and the ability to form coalitions to redress the imbalance of power that you get when you sit down at a negotiating table across from the United States, EU, or China. In the WTO, the least developed country group, which is the group of members who are sort of the poorest economies in the world that are part of the WTO, basically caucus together and try to speak with one voice, precisely because they know that sort of the individual voice of Rwanda may not have as much influence, but if it is the collective voice of the world's poor, which is certainly how they kind of represent themselves, that has to be taken seriously. And the WTO, through its consensus mechanism, the UN, through its mechanisms where you have to vote, and where every vote counts, kind of give those members a greater ability to influence global affairs than they would have in its absence. Yeah. So I think they are going to be champions of it to an extent, while still having immense frustrations with both organizations. That's forever. I would kind of also say that it's important to remember that, especially on the UN, there is the Security Council and the General Assembly, which, their performance you can have different views on. The UN is an absolutely vast organization that encompasses everything from the UNFCCC to, UNESCO, to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. It is this vast thing that does everything from refugee resettlement all the way through to sort of very, very wonky technical standards at UNCFACT about the terminology for blockchain customs. And so it's this vast thing that even if the General Council and Security Council completely loses relevance, the UN as a sort of global IGO, right, at the working level will continue to be relevant, especially to those countries outside the US, EU, and China, where they do a lot of their work.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and I'm no expert on that stuff. I would just add two things, and one is that, I think a lot of people say that it's China and Russia and perhaps, some of the other, maybe Brazil and some of the other countries that are trying to challenge that, liberal world order or the Bretton Woods architecture or whatever you want to call the sort of multilateral architecture of the world. I think the reality is that none of those countries or the people who lead those countries want global anarchy and instability. They want to change the balance of power within these organizations so that they can control them / influence them and, decrease US influence over them. But I don't think, China definitely wants global architecture to run the world. It just wants to be in charge, or at least be very, very influential within it. They don't want to burn it down.
Yeah. And I think outside of another Trump presidency, that is where the US is at as well, despite all of their frustrations with individual elements. That's certainly where the EU is at. The EU is never happier than when it is in a complex bureaucracy with multi-level decision-making. They'd build 5 more if they could. So the big players are also probably not going to smash the system, which means these things will probably limp on. And I look forward to all of the clips of, hey, this or this aged well, when the whole thing is disbanded.
In 6 months.
Yeah, in 6 months when Geneva no longer hosts anything.
Do you know what? If the UN and WTO and all that comes crashing down within 6 months, I will take the tweets, because we've got bigger problems.
Yeah, at that point. Well, maybe you do. I rely a lot on these guys for work, so my problems will be very acute. But that kind of brings us to the end of our show. Only 10 minutes overtime, and not the 8 hours we suspected. That is a win. We can take that home. Thank you so much, everybody who tuned in and put up with this slightly experimental approach. Hopefully we were not so obnoxious as to turn you off us forever. As we said, we will be putting the links to a lot of the sort of main articles we relied on to build today's show below in the YouTube description. We will also, of course, be putting a link to the International Intrigue Substack, or newsletter, I should say, which is free and excellent, and that you should all subscribe to. And so with that, my name is Dmitry Grozoubinski from ExplainTrade. With me is John Fowler from International Intrigue. And thank you for joining us for Intrigue Explained. We will see you next week.
Thanks, Dmitry.
Thanks.